My low end is Manny Marroquin's fault because in my early days, I did a mix. An A&R guy gave me a shot on a mix, and I did the mix, and everything was great. They loved the vocals, they loved the keyboards, they loved the snare drum and the hi-hats, but they didn't love the kick and the bass, and they had Manny do it. And of course that hurt your ego, but now looking back, it's like, dude, you were like 23 years old. Who cares? Whatever. It's like you still have some time to grow. But
That is so true.
I humbled myself and I delivered the files to Manny myself. And while I was there, I asked him, it's like, would you be kind enough to listen to my mix and just tell me what you think is wrong with it? Because I would just love to learn. And he said, you have no low end depth. It's like the low end's there, but it could be deeper and richer, and I forget the words he used now. But I immediately went out and bought a subwoofer because I was an NS10 guy. And I don't know. I just like, oh yeah, I'm not listening to, except on the mains when I'm in the SSL studios, I'm not really listening to the subs, and some studios are better than others, and some of the mains don't even sound that great. So I went out and bought these two little M Audio subs because I wanted headroom. So I bought two of them, and they were small. And I put those every time I went to a studio. I would put those with the NS10s. So started mixing like that, and then it was like, it's just life changing. It's like, oh well, now I'm hearing the low end, and it took me a while to get it. The subs dialed in at the right level. Every day you're in a different room, every week or whatever. And, but I was finally like paying attention to it more, in a different mindset. It's just, he just opened that up for me. He probably doesn't even know, but, yeah, I just started paying attention to it, and my mixes got way better. And there were some years where I had too much low end, and I probably still have too much, but,
well, that's okay. That's like a flavor profile,
Yeah, it's like Jello. You can never have too much Jello.
Yeah, I'm with you on the low end thing.
yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, I just kind of because I lost a mix, it just made me really start to focus on it. And so over the years, I was just always about finding ways to get the best low end, and sometimes it's a struggle, and it all has to do with phase of what you're dealing with and the raw sounds. And that's why I have a collection of thousands of bass drums I've collected over the years. And I've even on some live basses, I've even snuck and played live bass parts over because the sound was so horrible. And
wow.
Then I'll go by note by note and make the feel, look at the waveform and make the feel. This isn't something I do regularly. This has happened a couple times.
Emergency situations.
Yeah. But like the bass sound was so horrible that I would play it over and then match the waveform so that the feel was the same guy's feel. And also done stuff where I'll do a MIDI track on a synth bass, and I'll layer a deep octave or trigger. If I hear the bass and I can find the patch, which is a miracle, I might just, maybe they put too many plugins on it and they can't give me the original when I ask for it. So if I do have that same patch and I can find it quickly, I will recreate that, but those are very extreme situations. But I've always been on this path for great low end because it's fun. Great low end is fun, it moves you, it feels good. It just makes the record sound cool. And, worked with, back in the day, I worked with Heavy D on some reggae stuff and learned more about low end from him. And, yeah, so it's just always been something I paid attention to, and I've come up with so many techniques and weird things that you wouldn't think of. Frequency masking, just moving a frequency in the mids or the high end, and all of a sudden your 40 hertz is more exposed, stuff you wouldn't expect. And now that I know those things, I know how to look for them, and we got all these tools like Low End Focus by Isotope and different plugins, and they all sound different. And when I'm working, I'll hear in my head like, oh, this bass needs the UAD Legacy Pull Tech, and it's going to give me what I want. And I'll try it and be like, oh, it's not working today. Let me try this plugin. And then I'll hear it and I'll find it and find what works to achieve what I hear in my head. And I that's one thing I do as a mixer is when I hear the production and the raw tracks, I hear the end result in my head, and then it's just about working to get there. And sometimes you never get there. It's just not possible what you want to happen, and you have to compromise mentally. But yeah, so that's kind of how I work with low end. There's not one thing I do. It's just many things.
Yeah, you have a bag of
every day.
You have a bag of tricks that you can reach out of, and depending on the situation, you know which one. Can you give us like a couple examples of those voodoo tricks that you do? You mentioned like taking out the low end and like in the bass and then the sub, in the mids, and then the sub opens up.
Yeah, I mean it's really just about frequency masking, and you can of course have masking from things that aren't the bass or the kick, like a piano having too much lows and now it's covering the bass. That's something a lot of a lot of mixers already know about. But you also, within a sound, you can have one frequency that's just it's calling attention to your ears more, and you're hearing what you want less. So you can, like, let's say you want a deeper, richer low end, and you end up having too much 130 hertz. So you dip that a little bit, and all of a sudden you hear 60, 50, and 40 easier, And sometimes it's just about experimentation. Sometimes I have a hunch. And I've had the weirdest things happen where it's like, oh, well, we want the kick to pop out. Where it's like, well, solo that guitar. And we listen to that guitar, but like, okay, pull out 80 on the guitar. Now, let's listen. Now all of a sudden the kick is more punchy. So it's just having your mind open to being ready for those kind of things. And that's why I say it's kind of voodoo, because it's not something you can do every mix the same way. It's always different. And the next song, you're not going to have that guitar that has too much 80 hertz. You're going to have a piano that has too much 30 and 40 that you don't need, and you got to, filter that out. And then the next time you're going to have it wide open, and then you have to approach a bass totally different, because now there's so much space. There's nothing in the way, So it's, and the other thing is about phase and checking polarity.
Yeah.
Timing is a big thing.
Yeah.
I've had instances where kick and bass are perfectly lined up on the grid, and they hit every downbeat at the same time. And that's not the way it needs to be for the best low end. And you shift the whole bass, to the right 20 milliseconds, all of a sudden it just gels better. Sometimes you grab auto align and throw that plugin on, and it just gels better. Sometimes auto aligning the bass with Rhodes, all of a sudden way better. Sometimes just flipping the polarity on the Rhodes helps the bass, So it's just more something you have to be prepared for and have an open mind about the technique, rather than people that approach mixes like, oh, every mix I use the Pultec and I do this, and that's what I'm going to do on every song. It's like, I cannot think like that, because it never works for me doing the same thing. It's also why I don't have templates. Yeah. It's also why I don't have templates. I'll have a routing. I'll have a template in the aspect of my final summing masters going to my print track. I have a hybrid setup with a summing mixer. So we'll import that, and that's always the same. And on the master, I'll have the same plugins, and that changes every few months. But, and sometimes even on one mix, I'll swap one out and not use 3, and sometimes add 2, But that's about as far as I can go with templates. And then I have a vocal effects bank of like 10 different effects, and on certain mixes I'll pull those in and I'll just experiment and see what's working that day. Other times I just start from scratch and be like, oh, okay, I already know I want this delay, this verb, this doubler, this Haas effect, this plugin, and I'll just pull them in one at a time and make them. But I can't use templates because everything I do every day is different. So one day I'll have live drums and live bass, and the next day I'll have 808s, and so it's templates are not for me. Like, they just don't work.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's great. When you were talking about the bass sometimes being a little bit later than the kick, I heard an interview with Sean Hurley, who's like a well-known session bass player in LA. He was saying he likes to play his note like just right after the kick to give it that extra
Mm-hmm.
like that place. I don't know if I agree with that on a groove level, but on like a sonics level, I totally get it. You know?
Yeah, well, there's so much subtlety in that. It could be, I mean, for a player, that could end up being, 60, 80 milliseconds late. But from a technical aspect, it could be 10 milliseconds later from a mixer doing it. And the subtlety of that versus groove versus phase versus not flamming versus not
Yeah.
causing problems, all that stuff. I just had a song that was not done to a click because of the nature of the song. And I actually went through first to get the timing. I did this at the same time, but not only to get the timing of the bass with the kick, but also putting it in that optimal spot of sounding the best, but not changing the feel they were going after,
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, just think about
so
how long
sometimes
that probably took you so long.
oh yeah, I mean, it was a whole album, and that was at least a half hour for each song,
Right.
and but sometimes those intricate edit things can go so much farther than EQ and compression and
Yeah.
just trying to fix it. And it also that's a perfect thing to give you an ear break. Like, I was mixing a song with live drums last week, and once I needed an ear break, and that's the time I saved for my ear break was editing the toms and cleaning those up, because there was a lot of them, and I had to go through and do all my thing I do to toms, and that gave me a nice ear break. I could listen low. For a while I wasn't even listening, and I didn't need to play it. I could just do it by the waveform, and so sometimes those edit things give us a fresh perspective when we get back into mix mode. Sometimes they're a drag because you don't want to leave mix mode,
Right.
Mentally.
Yeah. The flow state or whatever.
Yeah, but man, they go so far. Having timing great and correct. I won't even say perfect. I'll just say correct.
Right.
It just makes the mix so much better,
Yeah.
And sound choice. That's the other huge one. Producers, I really respect producers that take the time to choose the perfect sound rather than just a sound. And I understand there's a creative element of just being in the vibe and grabbing stuff and having your flow. You can't mess that up because then you're really going to overthink things and ruin it. But the guys that go back later and be like, is there a better kick sound than the one I just grabbed when I was in the moment? And taking that time, I really respect that because it makes the mix better before we even start.
Right. Yeah. That makes so much sense. Yeah, I recently had a mix where it was like I just did a few like little time edits, and it just made such a big difference in the whole feel of the just like you were talking about. And it's like I love that these are the things that like we're not technically hired to do when you do a mix, right? But like
exactly.
it's editing, right? Like it's not mixing, but it's like that's going to get it over the finish line, right? Like in the best possible way.
Absolutely,
It's the big picture mentality.
Totally. There's things that we do in that realm that if the artist or the producer knew we were doing them, they would be totally against it. And if you have that conversation with them, they'll stop you before you even show it to them. But that's why I believe in just as simply as making a new playlist so you have the original to get back to in like 2 seconds. So you edit the bass, you get it better, and then you tell them about it after they've heard it. And if they hear it before you say something, then fine. It's like, oh, I did it at the bass. I was going to tell you about that. I think it feels better. What do you think? And then we're like, I don't know. And then they get some of them get paranoid. Some of them are thankful. They're like, oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much for doing that. Other ones are like, you mess with the bass. And there's like, oh, you're an engineer. You shouldn't be doing that. And it's like, actually, I'm a musician too, but whatever. But yeah. And then it's like, okay, you just take the time where it's like, okay, here's what I did and here's it original. And you expect them to agree with you. And sometimes they don't. Sometimes they're like, I like the messed up one better. They don't use those words, but they're like, I like the original better. And it's like, okay, well, I have a feeling you're just being attached because that's how you gave it to me and your pride or whatever.
Everything is demoitis, right?
Yeah, or maybe they really do hear it as better, and it's like, okay, well, I respect that. I just wanted to show you, so we'll go back to the old one, flip the playlist. There it is, you know. So I try not to ever disrespect people. Like in my early days, sometimes I would just hit play on a song for a client, and the drums would be not new rhythms, but new sounds. Be like, oh, there's a snare layered, and there's a kick completely replaced, and I quickly learned it's like, oh, well, you can't just completely disrespect people like that, you know.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to have that conversation where it's like, oh, hey man, I think this kick could be better with this other raw sound. Do you mind if I try? And you give them that respect. You have the conversation, or like I said with the playlist, you just have it ready to go. But like, hey, when they walk in, like, hey, I changed your kick, but I also engineered the original to its fullest. So if you hate the new one, I can 2 seconds switch back to the old one, and then you give it to them like that, and then they appreciate that you're respecting their production
Yeah.
and their artistry, and sometimes you win, and it's like, okay, great, we get to go with my kick. They do see it as better, just like me. I'm not crazy, you know. So
Wow, that's amazing. I'm curious in terms of like your low end mixing.